Hey everyone, my name is Anna.
My name is Priya, and this is the fourth video of our Outspoken series. Today, we had the opportunity to sit down and talk with Dr. Lisa Corrigan from the University of Arkansas, who is a professor of communication and director of the Gender Studies program at the U of A. And today, we got to talk with her about her research and intersectionality.
Hey everyone, so today we're joined with Dr. Lisa Corrigan, and we're first going to start off just asking her to tell us about herself.
Okay, so I'm a professor of communication and director of the Gender Studies program at the University of Arkansas. And I'm a feminist rhetorical critic who writes about the civil rights movement, Black Power movement, feminist theory, affect studies, the history of the Cold War, and the history of American public address. And so I teach and research around areas of race, class, and gender, basically in the last 120 years of US history, with an emphasis, especially in the Black Power and civil rights movements in third world decolonial movements that are influenced by Black Power. And so I have two books that have come out. The first is called Prison Power, How Prison Influenced the Movement for Black Liberation. And it's all about carceral politics and the politics of prison and the way that it influenced civil rights agitation from 1954 forward. And then I have a new book out called Black Feelings, Race, Affect in the Long 60s, and it's all about how feelings shape public policy and how public policy shapes our racial feelings. And so right now, I'm writing and thinking a lot about the relationship between race, class, gender, and feelings, and about how that shapes publics and public policy, and about the way that we think and feel about changes in public life that are particularly inflected with race, gender, and class. So that's my background. And I also have a second career. Then I work as a politician, as a politico. And so I do political trainings, and I train candidates and help with campaigns and write legislation and do oppositional research and develop coalitions across Arkansas and the rest of the South on issues ranging from public education to gun violence prevention to access to healthcare and certainly abortion and reproductive rights issues.
Amazing, thank you.
Yeah.
And could you tell us a little bit about some of the different types of feminism ideologies?
Yeah, I would say that there are a couple major veins of feminist thought, broadly speaking. I think if anybody's interested in like an overview of those, I would definitely look at Rosemary Tong's Variations of Feminism, which is a great piece on the history of feminism. I would say liberal feminism is the largest category of feminist theory and practical activism, and that's mostly reform feminism. So it's like, how can we work within the state to make things better, mostly for women, sometimes for children, sometimes for lesbians, but it's pretty narrow, right? So if we think about reform movements, the suffragists, I'm thinking about the centennial of suffrage, that would be a movement that was definitely reformist. A lot of those women were really, really anti-Black, and they wanted women's suffrage as a way to undermine the political power of freed Blacks, especially in the South. Radical feminism is obviously the contrast to that. So those would be folks who are really interested in radical shifts in the status quo. Abolitionists, right, who are both feminists and identified, right, with women's rights, but who also saw abolition as central to the project of freedom, really. They would be radical feminists. Marxist feminists then are socialists for the most part. They think that class is the most important organizing feature of public life, especially under capitalism. And so they're very interested in thinking about redistribution and distribution of wealth and property, and the relationship between property rights and ownership and the status of peoples, right? So that's women as property, or people of color's property, or settler colonialism as a practice of shifting property or creating property rights. And then the last is cultural feminists. And those folks are really interested in building like women's culture, right? So like, how do we create safe spaces for women? And, you know, sometimes that's inclusive feminism. So that's like all people who identify as women, but sometimes it can be very exclusive, and they could be TERFs who are anti-trans or anti-gay, but, you know, pro-female. And I think probably the biggest historical thing to come out of cultural feminism is like rape crisis centers, which have been pretty important. on the one hand for women and girls, but often they exclude boys and male victims of sexual violence. So it's sort of a problem. And with under that umbrella of cultural feminism is sort of Black feminism and womanism. Alice Walker, right, invents the term womanism to think about ways that Black women can participate in managing the consequences of capitalist heteropatriarchy without reproducing, you know, the structural violence of whiteness that white feminists have actually created through their reformist tendencies. Lesbian feminism obviously became really important in the 80s during the sex wars. And so those lesbian feminists were fed up with cis hetero women who are married to men and raising boys and working with men and defensive of those relationships, even while those women were benefiting from men who were anti-lesbian. And so they argued for a radical reorganization, especially of domestic labor and care work, but also wage labor. So, you know, cultural feminism is sort of a big umbrella, and a lot of the feminisms of color fall under it, and they obviously break down around different ideas based on the way that oppression has functioned in those communities of color.
So can you explain, or could you define what intersectional feminism is, and who does it impact?
Okay, so I would like to do that in two parts. So one, feminism is mostly about the liberation of women, girls, and people who identify either way, right? So that's not a biological thing, that's a social thing. And I would say intersectionality then is a separate thing. So intersectionality doesn't necessarily have to go along with feminism. You can be an intersectional critic or thinker or committed to intersectionality without identifying as a feminist. And I'm going to talk about reasons why that might be a thing that happens. So I would say that if I had to define intersectionality, it would be a large-scale framework that's used to understand the power of social categories like race, class, sex, gender, ability, etc. And that's then those categories and those frameworks are used to think about individuals and groups and the way that those categories create overlapping systems of both advantage and oppression. Right? So intersectionality is about thinking about what are the incentives and disincentives towards identifying in particular ways based on race, class, sex, gender, ability, what have you. So there are people who would not necessarily want to identify as a feminist, right? Because feminists, especially reformist feminists and sometimes cultural feminists, have done really, really terrible things in the name of feminism, right? And so there would be a reason why you would want to see overlapping systems of oppression in lots of different ways that aren't necessarily about privileging the voices of women or girls. So for example, if you're interested in, say, rates of violence against Black boys, intersectional feminism doesn't really account for violence against men at all. So that has been a huge problem with the literature on violence, right, that intersectional feminism comes out of. The very first essay on intersectional feminism was a piece called Mapping the Margins by Kimberly Crenshaw, and that piece was specifically about violence. So now Crenshaw would say, of course, we have to think about the ways in which anti-Blackness structures violence against Black men and boys, but, you know, I think a lot of feminists have taken up intersectionality and just erased violence against men or trans people or children who are not girls or not femmes as a way of understanding a project about women and or girls, and that I think is a problem. So we use intersectionality. Why is it useful? Because it allows us to aggregate data, right? We can say, here are the ways in which, right, violence or material disadvantage affect communities based on these different identity categories. And aggregating data is how you can generalize about harmful phenomenon, right? So right now we're living in this COVID moment, so it's really important to think about intersectionality because of minority health indicators. We all live in Northwest Arkansas that has one of the highest rates of child hunger in America. Why does that matter? Well, because we also have high rates of undocumented citizens who don't have access both to food or to healthcare, because of course healthcare is tied to employment and not a universal human right in the United States right now. So if we think about intersectionality, we want to think about documented status, whether they're documented or undocumented, whether they have access to food, or we're about to face a massive eviction crisis in Arkansas, right? We live in a state that has no tenants' rights whatsoever. So we're going to hit an eviction crisis for poor people who do not have a guaranteed housing or food or transportation, and that breaks down around race and class. So intersectionality helps us to aggregate data so that we can more fully describe situations of advantage or disadvantage, to have a fuller and more complete picture of how power and oppression are marginalizing certain populations in ways that are really, really material, right? That are affecting their everyday lived experiences. If we think about like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we want to think about the needs that aren't being met, right? That should be part of our Bill of Rights, right? The life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So that's housing and food and clean water and access to public education and to be free from violence or social coercion. And so if we think about freedom as the goal, I think it should be the goal of feminism or any other intellectual, preoccupation in democracy. Then I think intersectional analysis is really important in thinking about how do we identify places where we need to get free and help others get free.
So that intersectionality you were talking about, when and why did that arise, just historically looking at the pinpointed location of that kind of theory coming about?
So in the late 80s, there's a guy named Derek Bell. And so he started critical race theories. Okay. And so Crenshaw was part of a working group of Black lawyers who are interested in thinking about how to culture jam the law in ways that recognized its inability to produce conditions of freedom. Okay. And so there were all of these little micro conferences really in the 80s where Black lawyers were networking and thinking about different ways to intervene in the law. A lot of them were writing about narrative. And they were talking about how do we tell courtroom stories? How do we tell stories that animate why the law itself is producing massive anti-Black inequality? And so Crenshaw was part of that working group. She wrote Mapping the Margins in 1991 as part of a reflection of these much larger conversations involving lots of other critics. Mary Matsuda was, writing brilliant stuff at this moment. And obviously Bell has written Faces at the Bottom of the Well, which is, a classic. I just taught it in my graduate seminar. It's 30, 40 years later, and it still holds up. Right? And he wrote an essay called Space Traders that is absolutely brilliant. It's about what if aliens came to the United States and the president made a deal that they could just go ahead and take all of the Black people in America and we would not harm them. And so it's about sort of negotiating Blackness as a property of the United States and as an essential feature of its colonialism and the way in which the cotton oligarchy produced an economy that benefits white people, even though all of the labor was done by people of color, Black people especially, but also Indigenous people and later immigrants. And so that collective of critical legal scholars started thinking about ways to reimagine the categories of existence that produce legal categories, right? So wife, husband, right? Owner or owned, renter, right? Or property owner. And so there was a huge push to think through new ways of talking about political and material reality that more accurately reflected the experiences of people of color. And so another piece that I would recommend that's part of this moment is Cheryl Harris's Whiteness is Property, which is all about how whiteness itself is property, but also about how white people, they patrol their own whiteness as a form of property, and that's what causes them to produce violence. So Crenshaw's intersectionality came out of that impulse of these scholars of color, most of whom were Black, but not all of them, who were really thinking about these different identity markers and how they influenced who was on the receiving end of massive divestment from their communities, who was on the receiving end of tremendous amounts of social violence that was 100% sanctioned by the state. How could the legal system be used to reform those things, if it could at all? And what were the limitations of the social categories that the law used to describe people's lives? And so, the early 90s were there was just a proliferation of legal interventions that were feminist and were progressive by critical legal scholars about the law differently. This is the same moment where we get sexual harassment law and rape law and more progressive divorce law and a bunch of other things. And so Crenshaw is really being mindful of the way in which Blackness and femaleness have influenced her life and career in ways that were very different from her mother's or grandmother's. And she writes at length, in narrative about that process.
Awesome. So are there any misconceptions about this theory overall?
Yeah, I think it gets misused all the time. I think it gets misused. So, you know, in the academy, we talk about the oppression Olympics, right? And so there is this way. So I guess I should back up and think about the history of it. So what happened at the end of the 1960s and early 70s is that the federal government came in and basically bulldozed the civil rights and Black Power movements. And so almost all of the major social movement leaders that had a visible political platform or were public speakers of those movements were assassinated. And so the movements then succumbed, not through their entirely their own fault, to law and order politics in the United States that pretty much congealed under Ronald Reagan. And so, you know, white supremacy was the language of the day. Of course, Ronald Reagan's, you know, second re-election slogan was "Make America Great Again." And so that moment then shifted power. So a lot of the women who had participated in the civil rights and Black Power movements, the Black women who had participated, matriculated into higher ed. And so they were absorbed into the intellectual, you know, academic complex, and the Black men were murdered. And so the Black women then produced all of this Black feminism and incredibly cutting edge, you know, theory and philosophy and art and literature, but the Black men were shut out. And so what happened was then that Black men's, and men of color by extension, I would say, their life experiences as narrative, but also as aggregate data as victims of oppression, did not get included in a lot of this late 80s, early 90s stuff. And so I would say that intersectionality is useful, but it has to be applied to all people, right? So you can't just be like, well, I'm an intersectional feminist, you know, violence affects women disproportionately. Well, no, Black men were driven out of the academy. They don't exist in the academy in any numbers in any field. And so nobody's producing data about Black boys, say, or like, especially sexual assault, because it's so taboo. And so I would say that's a really important place to think about why. I write about Me Too. I do, you know, a lot. And I understand the impulse for women and girls to want to say believe survivors, right? Because we know that sexual violence is a thing that happens to women and girls. On the other hand, what would we say to Emmett Till or his mother? Right? America believed Carolyn Bryant that Emmett Till, right, assaulted her, whistled at her, possibly kissed her, and then he was lynched for that. So like, just because there is aggregate data, that doesn't mean that everybody is operationalizing that data, even in their own personal lives, in a way that's necessarily responsible, because race, sex, gender, class, and ability are still controlling their framework. Here's one more example on this. So I do criminal justice work. I'm interested in decarceration and abolishing prisons. So that's a really important space to think about, you know, what should happen, right, to people if harm is done to them. So I would say on the whole, a lot of feminists are like, people should be punished for something like rape or sexual assault, right? Well, how do you do that in a culture that does not have sex education? We live in a state that has zero comprehensive sex education. So people are having sexual contact with no information whatsoever. And so some feminists would say, well, you should have positive consent. Well, consent to whom? To him? To a man? So that means he already has the power to say yes or no, and his version of events is going to describe what happened, yes or no. And that's a problem, because if we were all free, consent wouldn't be a conversation. I would rather we all have property rights, right, and have the ability to determine our future and not have to give consent or have him withdraw it. So those are three examples where I think, you know, the misapplication of intersectionality does not necessarily get us to the complexity of the situation at hand. So it's not that intersectionality itself is a theory that has failures built into it. It's that it, like any other theory, it's evolving over time. And as more voices produce aggregate data, then not just anecdotes or not just first-person accounts, then we can have a larger framework for understanding how these categories of existence control bodies and produce advantage or oppression.
Is intersectionality
no, but I wish it were
anti-capitalism?
So tell your friends. It's not, but it should be, right? I think that so here's the thing that happened in the 80s, okay? So as a result of the fact that the civil rights and Black Power movements were totally destroyed by the US government, and if you want to read about that, you can read the COINTELPRO papers about the FBI's counterintelligence programs and the plan to assassinate, and which obviously came to fruition by the US government, especially during the Nixon years. What happened then is that because all of those visible social movement leaders were assassinated, then there had to be a recalibration of what it meant to participate in critique of the state, right? So if you're in a movement and all your leaders are assassinated, are you going to produce political activism in the same way? You're not, because you're sensible, right? So it's like, I'm not going to take one for the team. They shot the nonviolent guy. He was like the guy who was not coming for them, and they killed him anyway. So what space is left? And so social movement activism, not just in racial movements in the United States, but also in labor activism, the student movement, and feminism, then collapsed. So instead of doing theory work and political work around political economy, right? How is money produced? How is it spent? Who gets it? Who doesn't get it? How is it used to operationalize property? They move towards representational politics. So it's like, what's happening in literature? Who is producing graffiti art? That's the birth of hip hop, right? Through rap music, or slam dancing, or graffiti, or breakdancing, whatever. All of those representational things about art and culture were a massive departure from political economy. Do we have unions? Is there collective labor activism? Why not, right? We live in a right to work state. We're filming this in a right to work state where there are very few. There's a police union and teachers union, and that's it. And even those are limited. Thankfully, the police unions are limited, but not as much as they should be. They should be abolished. So, that created this tremendous inequality for the academics who were studying the movements, because it was much easier to watch a film and critique it than it was to actually rebuild unions, or to create class solidarity, or to think about redistribution or reparations or any kind of financial disincentivizing of oppression. And so that split, right, where they left political economy and thinking about money and property and moved towards arts and culture, really, I think, was a disservice for thinking about how power and oppression work. So Crenshaw's work on intersectionality is more important in thinking through property rights, really, than it is in representation. And so when we think about misconceptions, it's people who are like, well, here are my identity categories, and so I think blah. Or I saw this movie or this TV show or this art exhibit or whatever, and here's how intersectionality works in these ways. And that's fine. Okay, there's value in that for sure. But at the end of the day, if you want to build freedom, you have to combine the cultural representational stuff with political economy. If you don't know how budgets work, you cannot change anything, right? And I work with people all the time who want to be helpers and do political things, but I'm like, do you understand how state budgets work? No, then you cannot enter the conversation at the place that you would like to, because you don't know how the money goes. So if I could tell anybody anything about the misconceptions about intersectionality, it would be move beyond critiques of art and into political economy and thinking about money things. How is debt produced? How is property bought and sold? How are things financed? Who finances them? Who financed the legislation? Who bought the legislator, right? Who then sponsored the legislation? All of that political economy is where I think intersectionality has the most explanatory power and is the strongest in teaching us about the way that we relate with other people. What do you think about that, Priya?
I like that a lot. So I'm really thinking about what I want to study.
That's what I was thinking about.
And so
I want to hear about.
Yeah, I've been going back and forth with so I took a gender studies class at U Chicago, and that was my first even glimpse into that kind of field and that work being done, because at my high school there aren't any classes offered at all. And so I really loved the way just the methodology, and then the way that the papers are written, and a lot of it kind of went over my head because I wasn't used to reading those kind of critiques. Mm-hmm. But I really loved that. And so that's where I kind of got into sociology, because it overlaps a little bit, especially if you look specifically at gender within sociology. And so I really liked that. That's kind of where I was like, okay, this is what I want to study and what I want to do. But then at the same time, economics, taking that class, aside from the math and the very the financial calculations, the actual theoretical and developmental economics really interested me. And I feel that correlates so much with all the studies I was reading, and a lot of the arguments I feel are oh, that's not possible feasibly, we can't afford to do that, or all money, right, and how people feel about their own money. And so I've been thinking like a minor in econ because I really want to learn it, but I also want to learn specifically the intersection between sociology and not so much the like Wall Street math side of econ.
Well, econ is white feelings, right? So it's entirely producing a speculative like future around the perpetuity of white oligarchy. So it's mostly feelings driven with like fake math on top of it, right, to justify the decisions. So I would 100% support that. You should read a great book called The Color of Money by Mirza Baradaran. It's about the history of monetary policy and about how racist it is, and but how financial institutions produce and reproduce structural oppression based on ideas about property. Okay, now Anna, you were going to say something about this too, about thinking about. Your eyes both lit up when I started ranting about political economy. So I want to call you in here to comment before we move on to the next question.
I just like kind of have a passion of hating economics. Like I don't like learning about it. I don't like talking about it. But I think that's a problem, and that like a lot of legislators or just a lot of people in like theory, like critical race argue, like not just critical race, but just like critical theory, don't understand the economy. And I think that's why that's why some progress is being halted. I don't know. Anyway, but I never had like really thought about that until you said that. And I was like, wow.
Like it's critical. If you want to do any kind of justice-oriented labor, you have to understand monetary policy and financial institutions and the way that debt and financing work. I'm not saying that I have been ranting all over the internet at strangers in the comment sections of the local news channels today about money and how they work. But, you know, all of the white men are on the comment section today were like, well, we have no money. And I'm like, do you know how the Treasury Department works? Because I suspect that you do not. Actually, we just print our own money and devalue our currency all the time. Also, the GOP just totally removed the debt ceiling, so we can just spend at will about whatever. You know, also, do you understand how taxes work? It seems like you do not have a sense about how taxes are raised. So anyway, I'm just saying that I think that, you know, since given where you're at in both of your careers, I think it would behoove you to think about doing econ work, especially with, you know, cultural thinkers, people of color, feminists, who are Marxists, who are interested in alternative, right, operationalizing of monetary policy in ways that redistribute wealth and that actually, you know, create the conditions for freedom. Right now, there's a big conversation about universal basic income and why that's really helpful. Certainly, universal healthcare, universal childcare subsidies are part of that. But I just think that as a larger cultural, project, the failure to continue doing economic work as part of social movement activism when the social movements were destroyed by Reagan-era law and order politics radically undermined the possibility for freedom for the next 40 years. And so my entire generation grew up without any institutions that were doing sustained critique of economics as a space, as a sphere that was actively producing harmful categories of subjectivity. So anyway, go take those classes.
Yes, I also kind of related to that. When you do research, when you're looking at, especially like the econ part of all of the more critique-oriented papers that you work on, just conducting that research, especially big data and aggregate data, is like, I've been considering maybe even like any sort of computer science skills. Are they helpful for that?
Oh yeah, I would say data scraping. Okay, is going to be huge in thinking, especially if you're interested in attitudinal changes in the way that attitudes influence consumer behavior or political behavior. So data scraping, definitely. I also think graphic design, weirdly enough, like having that skill because of charts and graphs and the way that data are operationalized, like visually for people, given this moment, the COVID moment, and it's I think a hyper visual moment, right? So, you know, I'm a communications scholar, memes were like our thing. We invented them, right? So, and we named them. And so like that's 2,000 years of thinking about small bits of information and how to deliver them to publics. And so I think that for people who are interested in persuasion or creating, I was a college and high school debater, so I'm really interested in how you communicate data to publics. You know, I think visual representation are key. So if you can build graphs, you can be in the moment. There's a woman named Misty Orphan who's doing all of the COVID analysis freelance right now in Arkansas. She's Arkansas COVID on Twitter, and her data her data visualization is amazing. And so I think that it's useful to really take the time to learn graphic design, because of the way that data can be showcased to publics in ways that change their minds. You know, I think that graphic design is really important. I also think it's important at this moment where we're like, you know, people are late to the party about decentralizing space, but that's the only way that a bunch of these institutions are going to survive, is to move into smaller and smaller different kinds of arrangements of power. And I think that we're going to need to represent that visually in ways that demonstrate how centralization is racist and classist and homophobic and sexist. And so that would, I would say, would also be useful.
I have a quick question. What type of debate?
Get at me. You got me. I've got nowhere to be. So ask me your questions.
What type of debate did you do?
Policy. I was.
Oh my goodness, I do policy debate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I was on the team that's basically started race and gender crit and policy debate in the NDT. So my generation critiqued the resolution that was about Title VII in the Civil Rights Act, and about race, class, and sex. And so, yeah, you can read all of my stuff when I was
awesome.
a baby
Wait,
debater.
what school, what college did you go to?
University of Pittsburgh.
This is crazy. Small world.
Feeding is a mixed bag. It's useful. I'm really glad it happened to me. It's also totally toxic, but you know, like the rest of America, though, it's not like it's uniquely toxic. But yeah, I think for me, thinking about argumentation has been really central in finding my voice as somebody who's oriented towards freedom, right? As a feminist, but also race scholar. And it gave me a bunch of data and tools and literatures to help form a self that was competent, you know, enough to pursue this professionally, especially the white chicks. So, you know, I took my lumps with my sugar. There was more lumps than sugar, but it worked out.
When you were discussing UBI, I debated that for a month through PF circle.
I support UBI completely. I think, you know, the only hard thing is that what do you do with the antisocial people? Right? I think UBI is better than like a universal job guarantee, because then those people just get floated around. They're just like, you know, sex offending Catholic priests who just get a new parish. And so we don't want that. Right. So at least the universal basic income provides the income, but doesn't guarantee the actual job space, which I think is useful, because then there's some sort of social mechanism to improve compliance with, like, you know, social norms that are pro-human, not pro-death. But, you know, I think there's space for these things are going to happen. And your generation is going to have to be the one that carries the mantle on a lot of this socializing of the reward, because my generation watched the boomers just socialize the risk super hard and then just steal the wealth. So I hope that you get on that, because we're not allowed to have power now, right? Because our parents and grandparents are still they're the Joe Bidens of the world that are just holding it down.
Dr. Corrigan, I had one more question. This is kind of very specific, but I remember in econ, we always talked about how like unemployment rate could never be 0. And I was just curious, like, who decided that? And if that was...
Oh, yeah. White people decided that, Priya. You'll be not surprised to know. The reason for that is because if there is a permanently or underemployed class of people, they will always do your job for less money. So they can always be brought in to pick your chickens and not have health care or sick leave at Tyson. Right? They can always be brought in to, the entire food system, once the plantation economy was changed, and it wasn't displaced, it just changed. And especially once we increased immigration after World War I, the entire food system of the United States was shunted in a deliberate way onto undocumented workers and people of color. So food systems, I think, food policy, food security, that stuff is going to be really essential for your generation in thinking through intersectional policy issues. But it is the linchpin of the United States. Even though the cotton oligarchy was where the empire was built, Now it's the food system where the inversion of power is felt so clearly. So yeah, I think the reason that that exists is because it justifies underpaying and undervaluing labor. I mean, it's the irony of this moment, right? Is that all the essential workers are wage laborers for minimum wage or less, and they're mostly people of color, people working 2 jobs. So it's like, how can you be essential but be undocumented? How are you not a citizen, but we need you to make all of the food that we eat? That's great. I mean, it's so immoral and unethical. But the whole country is built off of this socializing of risk, but not socializing profit. And so you're going to have to bust the monopolies. Somebody's going to have to come for Bezos at some point. Best of luck with that. And figure out how to socialize the reward, right? Those billionaires definitely need to be taxed because it's wage laborers who produce the wealth that they're enjoying on their yachts. So, but no, we don't actually have to have an underclass of people who are dying in our neighborhoods to have the American dream. Like that is a fantasy of whiteness that has no basis in material reality whatsoever.
Just kind of going back to the
That's fine.
Intersectionality we were talking about.
Yeah.
And you might have already covered it a little bit, but how does intersectionality come up in your work and what you do on a daily basis?
I mean, I mostly write about radical social movement activism, right? So I'm interested in where social movements highlight perspectives that are underappreciated or maligned. So, I mean, I write about Black Power. The book that I have out right now was basically a protest. It was a letter. So I wrote an article and it became my first book. And then some white reviewers were like, we can't publish this. And they called me a cheerleader for Black Power, which is obviously sexist and problematic. And they were like, the Black Power produced nothing. And I was like, could it be that the state killed the leaders? It seems that that's what happened. So, okay. Also, it transformed, I don't know, the entire like social sphere of Black America, kind of important. So anyhow, so I wrote a response. The book Black Feelings started as a letter in response to a rejection, and then it became an article, and then it became a book, right? And so for me, intersectionality is the way that I have been pushing back in my discipline of study to radically change the way that we interact. So last summer, there was an editor of a journal, a really prestigious journal in my field, who wrote a super sexist, racist letter. So we took him down, forced him to retire, took his journal, started another journal, and produced 6 special issues of other journals that were highlighting colonialism in the field of communication, anti-Blackness, anti-trans behavior, etc. And so I think for me, it's been a way of understanding, even though I was really trained as a presidential scholar, right? So I teach classes on presidential address and the history of the Cold War and president stuff, because there was nobody to teach me how to do race work. So I'm sort of self-taught that way. So I have a bunch of other degrees and a bunch of other stuff, right? So I did a doctoral certificate in women's studies and had to go find all the critically race, gender, sex, class stuff elsewhere. And so for me, I'm trying to write that with other colleagues, right, into my discipline so that that's not the case, so that we are culturally competent on Indigenous studies and, Latinx studies and a bunch of it, trans studies and disability studies. And so, in a lot of parts of the academy, that's all nascent. It's new, actually, to think about intersectionality in a way that should inform everybody. Because, higher ed has been so specialized and it's been so siloed and it's very niche. And so you're not encouraged to be a generalist and think about, broader frameworks that cross disciplines. So I would say that it is, without a doubt, a theoretical disposition that informs almost all the decisions that I make and the things that I write about and the way that I teach and the way that I do public service work and the way that I train candidates and the way that I think about legislation and everything else. So, I think that intersectionality has value because it teaches us about systems theory. White people in particular are very good at saying, like, it's just one bad apple, right? That's just one example. It's like, no. Here's all the aggregate patterns. Here's how the data work. Here's how we can generalize about X people or Y people in terms of what their attitudes and behaviors are. So I think intersectionality has, real broad value. you know, even just thinking about econ, right? Or your classes that you might take in college, or the way that you were trained to think in debate. And really just debate is a good place because, you know, Black pessimism and anti-Blackness have been so controversial because debate is so racist. It always has been. It will continue to be so, while all of the head coaches and the students who participate, you know, 80% or more are predominantly white. So they're going to circulate stuff that makes them feel comfortable and happy. And that is dominance and oppressive, and it's material. It has material consequences for people. So I think the debate experiences in their horror show really gave me a really useful gaze into the monster, right? And how the monstrosity of whiteness functions to build power, and how little fascists are created, right? To go, I mean, one of my debate partners started the Club for Growth, which is the Koch brothers' major institution for funneling money into like really regressive political candidates. The other one is the National Security Advisor for Ted Cruz. So I see, right, how you know, the language of persuasion is weaponized against people of color and women and queer people and disabled people all the time. And debate was the perfect place to see that, if you were able to do so, right? And I don't mean to be ableist about seeing it, but I actually do mean it in this case in a very visual sense, right? The oppression in debate is hyper visible. So yeah, I think intersectionality is a useful place to start thinking through large scale aggregate oppressive systems.
Do you have any other advice for how young women can practice intersectionality or getting involved with understanding this history in their everyday lives?
I mean, here's the thing. The feminists were right that consciousness raising has to be a mode of engagement with the self that is transformative. Okay, so they were right about that. The problem is that thinking too much about the self can lead to narcissism and a preoccupation with the self over others. So I think especially for folks who identify as female or are in close proximity to femaleness or femininity or the category of women, I think it's really important to both understand the self, right? That means operationalizing who you think you are, what you want, why you want it, how you're going to get it, and how that relates to other communities. In addition to then also having cultural competencies about what other people want, what other people need, and how they're actualizing their own desires. Because I think the thing for women is that if in girls, especially in the South, is that there is no space for us to exist as autonomous creatures, right? Like, I don't know if you just saw the way that the Roberts decision is being operationalized in Arkansas around abortion, but you have to notify your rapist if you plan on terminating a pregnancy in Arkansas. And that's going to stay the case. And in 36 states in the United States, rapists have parental rights. That's visitation, right? I mean, it's wild. And why? Because there's no comprehensive sex education. It's not because all of the men are rapists, it's that they're empowered to assert their agency economically and physically over women who are not people, right? So I think for me, in thinking through, you know, what women and girls should be doing about intersectionality, it's about thinking through the self and its relationship to others, and that those two parts don't usually happen, and they don't usually happen together, right? So there is a responsibility, I think, that comes with being a feminist that's incumbent, and it's the most important ethical thing, that one has to be honest with oneself about desires and wants and needs, and also has to be conversant in understanding that other communities and other people have competing needs because of capitalism, because their needs are not being met by the state. And so the question is, if you want to build healthy and happy communities, those are only going to be as strong as the weakest member. A democracy is only as strong as its weakest citizen. So if you want a strong democracy, you cannot leave people hungry. You can't allow police violence. That's not democratic. So, if you have an ethical disposition towards the freedom of other people, right, and especially freeing people from oppression, that means that you have to understand your relationship to yourself and your relationship to the others as a constantly evolving ecosystem of desires and needs that have to be met. So I would say, there's a skill set that goes along with that, and that's about boundaries, right? So when you're young and you're living with your parents, you don't get to assert as many boundaries, right? Because you are actually their property, like legally their property. And as you get older, Then you have to learn how to assert your boundaries. This is what I want. This is what I do not want. This is how I'm going to pursue these things. These are my boundaries. This is negative behavior. This is oppressive. That's a stereotype. That's a microaggression. That's, violence, right? And you have to be able to navigate that complex landscape. And I think for a lot of women, they collapse because they don't have the verbal or emotional skills to navigate all of those layers of oppression. And so they can't do the interior work on themselves. And then they can't do the intimacy and trust with other people to build healthy coalitions or just even relationships. So you have to have a sense of your own boundaries, and you have to carve out space to be an authentic person, regardless of what your parents or family think. And that's hard because you have to make boundaries and you have to tell them no, and then they get in their feelings because those feelings are about property, but you have to do it anyway. And then you have to create coalition with other people. A bunch of the people that you're going to hang with in college, like you were saying in your dorm, are just going to be there because they were assigned there. They're just close to you in proximity. They're not your people. They just live near you. So don't mistake co-workers as friends. Don't mistake people you live with in the dorm as your lifelong friends. They're people you're sharing time with. Some of them may become friends, but most of them will not. And so instead you have to search out authentic relationships with people who can do intimacy and you can trust, that you can build solidarity with, so that you can ameliorate the suffering of others. So I guess I have some thoughts about that for you. I have some thoughts about that, about what you should be doing. I would also say that if the people are interested in this conversation or portions of it, I do have an award-winning podcast called Lean Back, Critical Feminist Conversations with my co-host Laura Wiederhoff. It was on Apple's new and notable list. It was one of the top 10 podcasts in the country in Pace Magazine. It was the top podcast in Arkansas in 2017. There are 9 seasons out. Laura and I just recorded a pandemic season over the internet that's hilarious and also gut-wrenching. So you might listen to that. I talk about all of these things in detail just like this on there, and you can get it on SoundCloud or any other place. But it's a much larger arc. There are probably 95 episodes or so where we talk about the intersection of politics and race, class, sex, gender, intersectionality, and themes in ways would be probably transformative for your audience.
I will definitely check that out.
We have one last question that we wanted to ask. Just, do you have any advice for young people wanting to learn more or get into the world of like feminism theory and critical theory?
Yeah, so I'm happy to do like my favorite folks to read. So I'm going to do that now, right? It'll be like a top 10, but I didn't really count out 10. I'm just going to list my favorites like at the moment. So I think if you're interested in intersectionalities and critiques of it, R.W. Connell, Raewyn Connell, was a vanguard Marxist Australian feminist who has written, I think, some of the most productive, provocative critiques of intersectionalities, like lacuna, the absences in intersectional theory. So I read everything R.W. Connell writes. I mean, just brilliant stuff. I would read Tommy Curry's The Man Not, which is all about Black male agency and the erasure of Black men and boys. Sandra Bartke is my favorite feminist philosopher, and she has a bunch of essays on the phenomenology of oppression that are very accessible from the early 90s. They're easy to read. They would be appropriate probably for your audience. I think you'll just dig her. She just died a couple years ago, but totally brilliant. Bartky. I would say in terms of feminist, futurist stuff, I would recommend some fiction. I think a lot of the futurist literature in particular gives a lot of avenues for understanding how to imagine futures. We're not good at that as a people. White people are terrible at it. But I would say Marge Piercy's Woman on the Edge of Time is amazing as race gender work and thinking about mental ability and institutionalization and childcare and community solidarity. I would say that, what else would I recommend? Obviously, The Handmaid's Tale is a classic now and it's enjoying a revival, but it's a smart book and there's a reason that it's resurfacing in, on TV, on Netflix now or wherever it's at. What else in terms of critical theory? I would read Faces at the Bottom of the Well by Derek Bell if you're interested in critical race work. There's a bunch of new indigenous studies about indigenous feminisms, and especially about colonialism and rape and sexual violence pre-reservation and on the reservation, as well as alcoholism and pipeline land rights, stuff that's coming out of like the Dakota Access debates, and just this influx of money around oil and oil booms in and around reservations that's worth reading about. So I would say those are the things, you know, that I would recommend off the top of my head. I think, I don't know, it's a very good moment to be your age, because there's so much more being written and talked about. So you have access to all of these platforms and spaces, right, where people are critically interrogating ideas as they pertain to women and girls and marginalized populations. So it's a very lucky time. There's an abundance that I'm glad exists for your generation. I think there's no shortage of places that you can find critiques that are usable and digestible on the internet in ways that did not exist certainly when I was your age. So I would say use the time in the COVID to mine the interwebs for the smart ideas and the TED Talks and the lectures. I would say one more thing. I would say probably the best writer is Sarah Ahmed. You know Sarah Ahmed?
With her work, especially in femks and things.
Yeah. So The Cultural Politics of Emotion is a great book. I would read everything. She has a great blog website, and I would read her pieces on unhappy queers and on complaints and killjoys. So I think that she has a lot of useful ways of thinking about feminists who complain about the status quo, like in workplaces or in families, and about the role of complaints and the role of killjoys and what it means to take up oppositional places and spaces that produce unhappiness for others, right? Because you're disrupting the security that they have in their own understanding of power. And I think that probably is a good place to mine skills, right? To be a confident and assured critique of power. So I would say everybody should go read her books. I mean, she's just absolutely brilliant. Order from Powell's books from Portland. They're unionized and they're wonderful people, and they're an independent bookseller that amplifies the voices of people of color. So stay away from the Amazon, order it from Powell's, you know. Yeah, so I would say do those things and read those books and, you know, engage with people who challenge you, and don't run away from people who have information that you don't have. The debaters understand this, but you know, the general population does not. They're like, I don't know, run away from the conversation, but also listening is a skill set that would behoove us, right, to cultivate. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Thank you so much, Dr. Corrigan, for your time. It was a pleasure getting to talk with you. We hope you enjoyed that video. Thank you so much for tuning in and learning about intersectionality with us and Dr. Corrigan. And make sure to tune back in next week for our next video in the Outspoken series.
And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe down below and turn on your post notifications. To find more Loud Women, you can check out our website, which is loudwomencommunity.org, and you can follow our Instagram at loudwomencommunity. We'll see you next week.